I want to welcome you back to Theologically Speaking, and this is part two of a discussion that I'm having with Dr. Leighton Talbert, our main theology professor here at BJU Seminary. And this is coming out of an event that we do once a semester here that's called the Theological Research Symposium. It's a forum for us to get together and discuss academic papers. And here the other day, he presented one that's entitled "A Proverb in the Hand is Worth Two in the Bush, a hermeneutical proposal for handling biblical proverbs." And last time we began talking about that, and Dr. Talbert laid out for us some general categories as well as a couple of genres to keep in mind as we are striving to handle the proverbs accurately. And we narrowed down to what probably comes to our minds first when we think of Proverbs, but actually is different from the book of Proverbs as a whole. I distinguished it this way: there's the capital P Book of Proverbs, and then within that collection, there are a lot of lowercase p Proverbs. And Dr. Talbert defined those Proverbs this way with four different parts to the definition. Number one, it's a portable saying in poetic form that expresses a general life observation and that is conditioned by a biblical worldview. And today we're going to take it to the next level as we wrestle with some of the hermeneutical issues that we inevitably are going to face when we are trying to deal with those lowercase p proverbs and understand them correctly, apply them responsibly. Now, with that, we recognize the other genre in Proverbs. Dr. Talbert talked about that. The lowercase p Proverbs often are called aphoristic in nature, but there's another kind that is called reflective wisdom. Occasionally, you'll hear people call it skeptical wisdom. That's not really my favorite word for it, but it's the idea of wrestling with large problems of life, and they're more extended in nature rather than being these shorter statements. So when we think about that category, we think right away of Ecclesiastes, we think of the book of Job, but maybe we don't realize that that is in the book of Proverbs as well. So every word in Proverbs is divinely inspired, but there is a distinction in the kind of words that we find. So Dr. Talbert talked to us about how Proverbs 1 to 9 and chapters 30 to 31 as well are different from the rest of the book.
Well, yeah, you have those two major categories: reflective, or sometimes it's called discursive wisdom. Discourses, extended, contextualized, fairly lengthy conversations about a particular topic, as opposed to the aphoristic wisdom, the collection of individualized sayings. All you have to do is just start reading, pick out any chapter in Proverbs 1 to 9 and read it, and then go to any chapter between 10 to 29. There's actually a subsection in there, 22b to 20 through 24, which kind of reverts to this kind of wisdom as well, the more discursive kind. But other than those 2.5 chapters, anything else in chapters 10 to 29, if you read a chapter of that, you'll see immediately how different that is. In 1 through 9, it's the whole chapter usually is devoted to one whole concept, developing one whole idea. There's, I think, 2 or 3 warnings about immoral women and so forth, and warning his son about that kind of situation. And then you step into a chapter in Proverbs 10 to 29, and it's just bam, 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 statement after statement after statement with virtually no connection or context. So the difference between those two is immediately apparent. We may just not think about Proverbs being constituted by two different kinds of wisdom literature. So, it's all called wisdom literature. It's all the book of Proverbs, but not everything in Proverbs is a proverb.
That's right.
As you distinguish. So not in the technical, formal sense of what a proverb is. Those are largely limited to chapters 10 to 29.
Yeah, no, that's great. And not to get too off track here, but I've always found this distinction helpful, even from a preacher's perspective. I've done some preaching and teaching from Proverbs, but we struggle with our normal expository method of doing a sequential
Mm.
outline of a passage and organizing our sermon according to verse by verse or unit by unit. And that works very well, actually, with Proverbs 1 through 9.
Right.
That can be done very naturally. It is lends itself to that. You can be effective that way.
Mhm.
But if you were to try to do that with a lot of the other material, what starts up in chapter 10, it would really be a stretching experience. You'd find yourself struggling to come up with an outline. You would find yourself repeating yourself a lot, which is why the normal counsel is when you get to chapter 10, at that point, focus more on your theme studies. And so pick out uh, big concepts that are going to be repeated in various ways in those chapters. Maybe something about the tongue, maybe something about relationships, maybe something about wisdom, whatever the topic might be,
Mm.
and then you're pulling verses from throughout, and that is consistent with some of our biblical theological approach for synthesizing a lot of biblical data in under one heading. And so what you're saying is significant for interpretation, but it's also significant even for the structure of our sermons
Mhm.
a lot of times.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, I want to shift gears here as we get further into this, and I want to read something that I was just reading this morning. So I knew a while ago that we were going to have this symposium and that we were going to be discussing this paper. So I decided I'm going to go to this very common devotional practice of taking a month or taking 2 months and just reading the proverb that corresponds to the day of the month. And
Mm.
so today is April 29th, and this morning I was in Proverbs 29. And here's a statement or two from that chapter. So this is verse 7. Um, no, verse 6. An evil man is ensnared in his transgression, but a righteous man sings and rejoices, right? An evil man is ensnared in his transgression, but a righteous man sings and rejoices. And it gives the impression that somebody is given over to sin and they're going to be entrapped by that and end up suffering terrible consequences.
Mm.
On the other hand, somebody who is doing the right thing is going to live this upbeat and happy kind of life, right?
Mhm.
And even on the surface, and probably even a child reading something like that, if he's had any experience in life or observing circumstances people go through, would be able to bring up objections or be scratching their heads like, well, how's that true
Mhm.
if this other thing is true that I clearly observed take place? All right. So that would be an example. Let me drop down a little bit further. And, here's a verse that I remember because my parents brought this up to me from time to time as I was growing up. Verse 15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother.
Hmm.
And there would be many people who would testify in their own experience to the truth of that and how the Lord used the rod and reproof to give them wisdom. And had they not had the rod and reproof, they would have brought their mother to shame, right? But the reality is that plenty of children are disciplined faithfully and lovingly by their parents, and they don't end up being wise people.
Mhm.
So that the rod is not the sole or the automatic solution to the problems in the minds and hearts of kids. And even the other part, the contrast, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. You can also point out situations where children who did not have godly parents and who did not have the advantage of this kind of biblical discipline, by the grace of God, turned out to be
Mhm.
upstanding citizens, came to Christ, have developed godly character, and despite their poor upbringing, are not bringing shame to their mother, and actually are striving to honor a parent who maybe didn't do a very good job. So These are the kinds of questions that we're wanting to get into now. These are
Right.
just a couple of examples where you read some of these proverbial statements and you appreciate their wisdom, and you can think of ways in which you have observed that, but you can also think of exceptions.
Right.
Right? So how do we account for those kinds of exceptions?
Well, it starts really again back with the definition of what a proverb is and what it's designed to do. It's
Okay.
not designed to be a universal principle that's always true and absolute. It's not designed to be a promise that if you do this, this will always be the result. It's a general life observation. It's, we have this isn't a proverb, it's a rule of grammar, but I before E, except after C.
Right?
The exception doesn't mean that I before E is not valid. It's valid most of the time. But the exception demonstrates that the first part is not an absolute. And that's the way a proverb sometimes works. It's a bit of advice. It's an observation of the way things typically should work according to God's creational norms. But because it's a fallen world, it doesn't always work out that way. But again, that doesn't undercut the validity of the basic observation or the basic proverb. So, you mentioned a couple. Others would be something like this is Proverbs 10:27, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. We're aware of godly people. I use the example of Robert Murray M'Cheyne and David Brainerd,
Hmm.
godly men who died right about a century apart from each other, both at the age of 29. And, you look at Manasseh, Judah's most wickedest king, who's also the longest reigning king
Right?
in Judah. So you look up, you read that in your text, you lift up your eyes and look around, and it's like, I don't see that all the time. I see exceptions. Yeah, there are, the rule seems to generally apply, but there are clearly exceptions, but that sounds like an absolute. If we understand that the proverb isn't intended to be an absolute, it's intended to be a general observation. The problem is not that the proverb is fallible. We just need to remember that the proverb is a proverb.
That's right.
It's not an absolute. It's not a promise. So, you mentioned one about child rearing. Of course, the one that everybody thinks of, if you're a parent at all, of course, is 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. And there are, people have wrestled with that. So there are at least 5 different interpretations of exactly what that means. But almost no matter how you interpret it, you are aware of exceptions to how that sometimes happens to work out. So regardless of how you interpret it, it's hard to defend that as an absolute promise with no exceptions. It's a proverb about the general value of pedagogy. It's not an absolute promise that, if you do certain things, then this is a magic formula. It'll always work this way.
Yeah, that's great. And so this is where all of this talk about genre makes a difference.
Right.
So if you are expecting a proverbial statement to be like something in the prophetic books, where it is God is going to destroy the Assyrians, or the servant of the Lord is going to die for our sins, or the Davidic king is going to establish the kingdom, right?
Right.
We take those as promises, and on those promises hangs the reliability of God's character, right?
Mhm.
But these kinds of statements are of a different character,
Yeah,
and that shapes how we approach them.
we understand that with proverbs that we're accustomed to. The famous Ben Franklin, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Nobody believes that's an absolute foolproof formula for success in
right.
life. But nobody would deny that's a pretty smart way to live
That's right.
and a profitable way to live.
Yes.
So we understand that intuitively when we think of proverbs in our own culture, but somehow because we're reading this in the Bible, we assume, well, that has to be then an absolute. It has to be a promise. There can't be exceptions because it's in the Bible.
That's right.
But if there are exceptions, or excuse me, if there aren't exceptions, if there aren't times when we realize this is just an observation, a general observation that may have exceptions, then we're actually turning it into something other than a proverb. That's just
right.
the way a proverb works.
That's
and
right.
that works the same way in the Bible as it does outside the Bible.
And I think another dimension is connecting this with the fullness of God's revelation. So
Mm-hmm.
take the example you gave, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. All right. So that is a helpful principle. And we understand the value of early to bed, early to rise. But nobody would say those are the only factors that go
Right.
into becoming healthy, wealthy, and wise,
Sure.
right? So you've gotta have a work ethic, you've got to have a skill at your job, you've got to have wisdom in how you handle your finances. It's not just this one little
Mm-hmm.
thing. It is that plus a bunch of other things. And so we have to ask the question, when God makes these statements, there's the genre aspect, but then we also have to ask, what else has his word revealed on these topics? And
Right.
so even in the wisdom books, you've got somebody like Solomon in Ecclesiastes who says you could have a super wise king who, does all the right things, and his son ends up turning out like a fool,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even he's acknowledging in another passage the another dimension to this, to have a more comprehensive perspective. So I think comparing scripture with scripture is going to be a part of this
Sure.
process.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now we start going down this path. It's like, okay, so does that mean everything in Proverbs needs to have an asterisk by it?
Yeah.
Are there exceptions to all these things? Is there any kind of stability to this? So can you
Right.
talk about that? So how do the exceptions apply across the board, or how do we understand
Yeah,
that?
that's a really important clarification to make, because if you read much in the literature on Proverbs or hermeneutics, almost everybody will say, well, Proverbs admit exceptions. And that we get the impression from that that's true across the board, and any proverb may be susceptible of exceptions. And that's really not the case. I would prefer to say that Proverbs may admit exceptions, or Proverbs are susceptible to exceptions. But that doesn't mean that a proverb, by definition, is always going to have exceptions. Proverbs can be stated in different forms, in different ways, or deal with different things, some of which an exception isn't even on the table. It would be absurd to try to think up an exception. So you have to take a proverb again at face value as what it is, but that doesn't mean that all the proverbs in Proverbs are just riddled with exceptions and there's always going to be exceptions. I would say that the vast majority of Proverbs are in a form or stated in a way that actually don't admit exceptions.
Okay.
But there are those examples that do.
Okay. And you have two specific categories. One is observational proverbs
Mm-hmm.
and deity affirmation proverbs. So
Yeah.
can you talk about those, maybe illustrate them a little bit?
Observational is really a very broad category. There's all different kinds of observations,
Okay.
descriptive, some of them are similes. So most proverbs simply take the form of an observation of some kind or other. So for example, in Proverbs 25, I'm just going to jump right into verse 13. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him. He refreshes the soul of his masters. Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of his gifts falsely. You think about those similes and those descriptive comparisons, and you can't really come up with an exception to that. If the terms of the proverb are taken at face value, then there really isn't an exception without changing the terms. Have you found honey? This is verse 16. Eat only what you need, that you not have it in excess and vomit it. I mean, that's too much of anything is going to make you, well, you say, I could eat more than is good for me and it wouldn't make me sick. But, you can really strain to find exceptions to some of these. But if you just take them at face value, there really isn't an exception to be had. Let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will become weary of you and hate you. Just as a general observation, don't wear out your welcome. We say that. Okay, that's
Right.
a proverb for us. So most proverbs, I would argue, are stated in a form or have to do with content, the content of descriptive observations and advice like that simply isn't stated in a way where exceptions even become an issue. And again, I would say that's true of the vast majority of proverbs in terms of how they're stated, how they're expressed. When you get to what I call deity affirmation proverbs, that's the anomaly that I came across and that I started thinking about and trying to figure out, okay, well, if Proverbs admit exceptions, like everybody says they do, and I think they do, at least they may admit exceptions, then what are we to do with these Proverbs that talk about the character of God,
That's right.
person of God? So the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Is that true sometimes? Is that true most of the time? Is that true all the time? The sacrifice of the wicked is detestable to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. The Lord detests the way of the wicked, but he loves those who pursue righteousness. If those are all Proverbs proper, and they all come right out of that middle section of Proverbs, chapters 10 to 29, and Proverbs by definition and design may admit exceptions, then what do we do with those? Are those statements about God true sometimes, but not all the time? That's the lacuna that I kind of discovered in all of this Proverbs literature that nobody really addresses
Right.
or explains, because I think virtually all of them would say, well, of course, these deity proverbs don't have exceptions. God is always this way, but they never really explain why and how that works in the context of Proverbs that, again, everybody keeps saying they admit exceptions. So the solution, I think, is not particularly profound. It's just very rarely, if ever, stated. And again, this goes back to the fourth component of what a proverb is. Proverbs, they are culture conditioned and they are worldview reflective. And a central component of the covenantal worldview that shaped the culture in which Israelite, or I should say, from which Israelite proverbs emerged, is the theology, the immutability, and of the character of their covenant God Yahweh. So a proverb that affirms moral absolutes about about the character of Israel's covenant God, which never changes, okay, are of necessity going to be absolutes. That's part of their religious worldview, their theological worldview, because the changelessness of God is part of that worldview, and that's what shapes their proverbial literature. So a proverb that affirms the truth about Yahweh's person or about Yahweh's character is one of the exceptions to the rule about Proverbs admitting exceptions.
All right. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. This is something that I started thinking about myself. I don't remember. It's been a while when I've been studying Proverbs and thinking about all these commentaries that talk about exceptions. And I thought about a passage that probably a lot of believers could quote, right? So we're heading into graduation season, and there are going to be graduation speeches and cards given and so forth. And a lot of them will quote Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. That's in Proverbs, and you have other statements like that throughout the book, like in chapter 16 about how the Lord is, directing people's paths and so forth. So are we to say that that has an exception? I mean, why would we want to do that, particularly given that the Old Testament makes statements like that about the Lord in other books, other genres, and the Lord doesn't change. All right. So those kinds of statements are absolute affirmations of the dependability of God to direct your paths, or whatever aspect of his character, his works are being discussed there. And so they are a very significant, but sometimes neglected exception to this category of exceptions that people will bring up about Proverbs.
Yeah, yeah.
So toward the end of your paper, you had a very helpful chart that, well, first of all, a list of questions to ask, and then a chart that illustrates some of these categories. Can you walk through those for us?
Yeah. The first question that I suggested is if you're talking about a proverb, a statement from Proverbs, let me put it that way, is it located in the reflective wisdom section, chapters 1 to 9 or 30 to 31, or is it in the proverbial wisdom section, the aphoristic section? And I argued in the paper that the reflective wisdom that you have, for example, in chapters 1 and 9, does not admit exceptions. And your pushback on that point in the symposium was very helpful, and it raises some issues that I'm still thinking through. But I think just starting with the recognition that of the very different nature and function of discursive wisdom, say in the first 9 chapters, and the collection of brief, pithy, aphoristic statements in chapters 10 to 29, that's an important place to start,
For sure.
recognizing that difference.
Yep.
Again, not everything in Proverbs is a proverb. So once you've established that, second question, is it a theological statement regarding the character of the unchanging God? And that's the major anomaly that I'm trying to resolve with what I call deity affirmations. And we already talked about some examples of that. There are about 55 or so Proverbs in 10 to 29 that say something about the character or the person or the being of God. Those do not admit exceptions, not just because, this is important, I think, to clarify, not just because we believe God never changes,
Right.
not just because, the rest of the Bible teaches that God never changes, but because that conviction that God never changes was an inherent part of the worldview of the biblical wisdom writers themselves, based on the Pentateuchal revelation that shaped and defined their worldview.
That's right.
So, for example, there's an Egyptian proverb that says, "Make monuments for the god. This is what preserves the name of him who does it." Hard to imagine Solomon writing that. If you want to be remembered as great, make a monument to the god. Doesn't quite fit the
Right.
Israelite conception of God.
Yeah.
A Babylonian proverb says, "Reverence begets favor, sacrifice improves life, and prayer dispels guilt." That works in a Babylonian religious society. That doesn't work from an Israelite worldview, okay? That doesn't fit. So there are statements that, again, are religiously grounded in other religions, but they're different because the Israelite theological groundwork, worldview, culture is very different because it's grounded in that Pentateuchal revelation. So that's an important question to nail down. Is it saying something directly about God? If that's the case, then it does not admit exceptions, because part of the worldview is it does not, God's character doesn't change. Another question then would be, is it a generally operable principle within a biblical worldview that may be subject to the providences of God? There may be other considerations that would cause this not to be an absolute. And again, we talked about some examples already. The appetite of the sluggard craves, but it gets nothing, but the desire of the diligent will be abundantly satisfied, and other proverbs like that. If that's a general observation, that's typically true. God rewards industry. God, there are consequences for being a sluggard and so forth. The general principle is valid, but we can see exceptions to it. So that's another question that you would want to identify. Is that the kind of saying that it is? And then beyond that, is it a saying that circumvents exceptions? Is it just basically a sagacious observation, a pedagogical principle, a word of advice, a qualitative analysis? You got these better than kinds of proverbs. Better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than he who is perverse in his speech. Again, that's the kind of statement that there's really not an exception to. It's in a form and of a nature that doesn't admit exceptions, that exceptions just don't compute. As snow in summer and rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. Again, it's not good to eat much honey, nor is it glory to search out one's glory. So there's all kinds of observational, didactic sayings, advice sayings, qualitative sayings, comparative sayings that make up, I would say, again, the majority of Proverbs that, again, exceptions just don't compute. It's not an issue. But then there is also one last category of admonitions, which makes up maybe about 4% of the Proverbs in 10 to 29. If you read Proverbs 1 to 9, they're all over the place. About 25% of those verses are admonitions. Admonitions are pretty rare in Proverbs, but you do have them. Sometimes a positive command: apply your heart to instruction and your ears to the words of knowledge. How are you going to find an exception to that? There is no exception. Or a prohibition. Do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. There's really not a viable exception to that. So that category, when you raise the question of exceptions, again, it's basically not applicable. They're framed in a form that circumvents exceptions. So to describe Proverbs as promises is really part of what perpetuates our confusion sometimes,
yes.
because they sound like a promise. It's not a promise, it's a proverb, and proverbs work differently than promises. So what I try to do in the paper is offer a more consistent, a more, I hope, theologically objective, more biblically, theologically robust solution to the problem of proverbs and exceptions and absolutes. So by definition, a proverb is not a promise. It's not an absolute truth. It's really more of a truism,
Hmm.
a generally valid observation of how life tends to work in God's world. And the exception to that then is when a proverb ventures onto the holy ground of the unchanging person and character of Yahweh. For those, there are no exceptions.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. And it strikes me that compared to what I was saying at the beginning of our first episode, this is an example, right? I was making the comment from chapter 1 that it requires wisdom to use the Proverbs correctly. Dr. Talbert's proposal is summarized by these 5 questions.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't giving us all the answers.
Right.
They aren't automatically resolving the struggles that we have, but sometimes we make a huge step forward just by even knowing what the right questions are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And frankly, from the reading that I've done on interpreting Proverbs, some of these are bringing out elements that really do not get the attention that they should. Maybe because the author is taking it for granted or just hasn't thought through this level of detail. But in my mind, this is a significant step forward in the conversation. And so thank you so much for all the work that you've put into this as you've meditated on Proverbs, as you've taught Proverbs here at the seminary. And maybe we can convince him to polish this up, and we will publish it in our journal sometime. So you all be looking for that, and we will plan to see you next time. Thank you for joining us.